They're actually modern. They have flush toilets and everything.
Doug is a longtime resident of Yavapai County, I think being born in Prescott.
No, I was born in Safford, but I went to high school and grade school in Prescott.
And he got his bachelor's, I believe, from ASU biology.
I did.
And he and his father ran an insurance company for a number of years here.
Yeah.
His sister was very instrumental in starting the credit union that I've got my house through. So this man is well connected.
Yes.
And he knows, as a biology major, he knows every nook and cranny of the river. Doug?
Thank you, Ruth. So, thank you all for coming. They offered me a microphone, but I'm used to speaking loudly in this room. If you can't hear me, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? There's some people here I know that know the river better than I do, or as well as I do, so if I make a mistake, don't point it out, okay? Just kind of let it lie. So, as Ruth said, I went to grade school over in Prescott, and I actually hang out here because my grandparents lived over here. They started a Western Auto Store where the Red Rooster is. We built that building. And I would come over and hunt and fish and everything on the Verde River when I was a little kid. So I've known the river for about 60 years. And it's been through, excuse me, gigantic changes in that 60-year period. Rivers are all dynamic. Almost all of them change a lot. They'll wander from place to place in their floodway, or they'll be bigger or smaller, or they'll in size or become ponds or whatever. And this river is one of the most dynamic things, the most dynamic rivers anywhere in the West. So you can go, some of you, Jim will attest to this, for instance, down to the river in various places. I've kayaked that river, I don't know how many hundred times, the same exact stretch. This year, last year actually, this year, February 3rd, we had that large 16,000 CFS flood. I kayaked it after that flood, and I did not recognize the river I was kayaking. It had changed to that extent. And there are places in the river that are now a quarter mile from where they were when I was a kid. They'll move over to one side, they'll move over to the other, they'll be deeper, they become ponds. Dams come and go, thank you. All of those things mean that if somebody shows you a picture of what the river used to be and says, well, the river used to be like this and now it's all screwed up, it's over here, that's been going on for 1 million years, right? So we're going to go through a couple of photographs of the river and Peck's Lake. So I'm going to lump Peck's Lake in because Peck's Lake is really important to the people in Clarkdale and in the Verde Valley. Again, when I was younger, when I first lived in Clarkdale, we had our fireworks exhibit out there. There are cabanas where you can picnic and whatnot at Peck's Lake, and people actually water skied the lake. But it wasn't always a lake. It was the river to begin with. Verde River used to come down past us here, turn toward Tuzigoot, and then made a northward turn up through what is now the tailings that have been reclaimed. Then it turned back around, back to the south, and re-entered its current course kind of at the foot of Tuzigoot, just past Tuzigoot. And that old oxbow is where Peck's Lake is. But the river broke through right at the foot of Tuzigoot and straightened out, and it abandoned that oxbow. I'll talk about some interesting aspects of that oxbow and what's going on there now and what we kind of expect to see in the future for that too, because people in Clarkdale are very concerned about Peck's Lake because of what it meant to them as youngsters around here and what it has always meant to the town. This opening slide kind of shows you two Clarkdales from just about the same place. This is what the river looks like pretty much today on any summer or spring day. That's what it looked like back when the smelter was operating. It wasn't just this smelter, it was a smelter that was in Jerome previous to that, the smelter in Clemenceau, the smelter up here were operating, and a lot of other really negative things were impacting the river at the time these photographs were taken, the top one and the one on the left. And those were things like cattle. We had about 100,000 cattle in the river at that time that just kind of wandered freely, and cattle eat everything that they can eat. And you had the smelters, which created such bad air quality that the mining company actually had to buy all of the farmland, and I'll show you a picture of that farmland, that was upstream from Clarkdale and around Clarkdale and Cottonwood, and that's why Freeport-McMoran currently owns all of that property still. So it was owned by the United Verde Copper Company, which was sold to Phelps Dodge, and then Freeport-McMoran, and that land is now being managed kind of passively by Freeport-McMoran. It's also the same land that the town of Clarkdale leases from Freeport-McMoran for the Verde River and Clarkdale recreational projects that we have up and down the river. We'll talk a little bit more about those. So besides the smelter and the cattle, we also had people that were gathering firewood and using wood for fuel. You don't see any trees in these pictures, but this is the same stretch of river. All of that green belt that you see did not exist when I was a kid. So until the smelters closed down and they got the cattle out of there, the river has been recovering, and it's now, I tell everybody when I take them on my trips, probably the most diverse and the biologically healthiest I've ever seen it. It's a completely different river from before the smelters and the mines and everything else in the area. Let's see if I can. Oh, that worked. So we generally concern ourselves in Clarkdale and all the conservation efforts that are going on with the Verde River Institute, the Friends of the Verde River, Nature Conservancy, and others, are working to conserve, not preserve, but conserve this area of the river. And it stretches, we generally work from about Sycamore Canyon down to below Camp Verde. And that down to Beasley Flat. So you're looking at 45 or 50 miles of river as it meanders through the Verde Valley. It's more like 25 as the crow flies. But that 45 miles of the river is the most impacted section of the 192 miles of the Verde River. It starts right over there near Paulden, north of Prescott, so north of Chino Valley, small town of Paulden that gathers water from Granite Creek and Del Rio Springs and a couple of other little watersheds like that. And then starts out at about 20 or so cubic feet per second. That's how we judge river flows, is that how many cubic feet of water will go past you in 1 second. So it comes out of the ground and it gathers that water from Granite Creek and Del Rio Springs at about 20 cubic feet per second. It gets down to Perkinsville, and by the time it gets to Perkinsville, it's down to about 10 or 11 cubic feet per second in the summer. Where's that water going?
Evaporating.
Not going into the ground, but I wish it were.
It's evaporating.
It's evaporating and transpiring from the trees and bushes that use it all along that. That's a significant thing because it's not getting any new contribution from other springs in that first 24 miles. So those are the 24 miles that are most at risk in the Verde River because of the fact that it's not getting any groundwater and it has very high evapotranspiration from all of the trees and things in there. That means if you lower the initial springs up by Prescott by 10 cubic feet per second, that stretch will go dry. That's important.
It is.
Because there are a lot of things wanting, a lot of other people, a lot of other homes, a lot of other businesses that want to use that water from the place that supplies those springs. That water gets in the ground from snow and rain and whatnot, mostly in the wintertime, right now, and infiltrates into the ground, flows downhill toward the river. If you suck it out of the ground before it gets to the river, guess what? The river pays that price. A gallon per gallon. Every gallon you take out of the ground is a gallon that doesn't make it to the river. Right here, we're also sucking up water out of the ground before it gets to the Verde River. And every gallon we take out and consume, it doesn't go back into the aquifer somehow is depleting the Verde River. So the big challenge of all these organizations that are working now to conserve the Verde River is, how do we make sure it continues to flow? Because we found out that rivers without water are just completely different things. Javelina love them, but that's about it. Rivers are there for fish and beavers and muskrats and otters and all of the wonderful things that we love the river for, and all of the trees that are along it. So that's what we're working on. Make sure, number one, that the river has water in it, that it continues to flow. Make sure that the ecosystem that surrounds the river, which we call the riparian belt, which is all those Fremont cottonwoods and Gooding willows and Arizona ash and sycamore and all the beautiful trees that we love down there, are there because there's water in the river. And those trees support an ecosystem that is the most diverse anywhere in Arizona. There are more species of birds, animals, fish, algae, plants, flowers along the Verde River, within about 100 feet of it, than anywhere else in the state of Arizona. And in fact, about 2/3 of all life forms in Arizona, 2/3 of all the things that can possibly live in that riparian zone. That's worth conserving, right? And you all are a bunch of conservationists. I know you are. That's why you're here. We conserve buildings. We preserve some buildings. We conserve more. And in a river, you can't preserve. You cannot lock this river into a particular state. It just won't cooperate. It's going to do what it wants to do. So all you can do is make sure that it's healthy in that process of changing. And so that's what we're working on. Very, very difficult, very complex conservation project. And a lot of the most innovative conservation that's going on anywhere in the world is going on right here in the Verde Valley today on the Verde River. Some of the things that have to be done in the Verde River are somewhat controversial. We're introducing a lot of recreation into the Verde. So 10 years ago, if you kept track of kayaks on the Verde River, you'd probably know everybody that you saw. And you might see 30 or 40 in a year, maybe. When I was a kid, 1 or 2. Today, on the stretch from Tuzagoot up to Tapco, we had about 8,000 last year. So a lot of concern about what you do to a river when you introduce 8,000 boaters on it, right? What's going to change? What are you going to do? What are the birds? How are they going to respond? How are the fish and the otters going to respond? And what we found was they were pretty welcoming, actually. What we see now is the cleanest river that I've ever seen. There's no trash in that entire stretch of river, right? No trash, and the reason is all of those people, and people like Jim Mass sitting back here who help us do that and teach people that there's an ethic about boating. They pick up all the trash. They don't leave it aside. They treat the Verde River with a lot of respect. And because of all those people coming to town to kayak and everything else, the economy of the Verde Valley is better than it would be otherwise. So it's a big deal for preservationists, conservationists to kind of commercialize this wonderful thing. It seems counterintuitive. You shouldn't do that. But what we found is if you do commercialize it to a manageable extent, you also build a big constituency of people that want to see that river continue to flow. And if you don't have that constituency of people that want to see it flow, you're going to lose it, because it's all going to get sucked out of the ground, and they're going to build more houses and more businesses that want more water. So when I, as the mayor of Clarkdale, want to tell the people of Clarkdale you need to use less water, they have to have a reason to do that. I have to say every year, these are the lowest water rates you're ever going to pay, are the ones today. It's only going to go up. That's not a popular line for a politician, right? But people have to understand that unless you conserve that water in the Verde Valley, we're going to do more damage than anybody can ever do up in Prescott. We can do about 50 CFS worth of damage down here. They can only do it 10 or 15. So it's a big deal that we get people to change their lifestyle and use less water so that we still have it in the river. And if I ask you to raise your water rates, you're going to have a good reason to do it. So that's what all of these conservation projects are incorporating into their thought process. Again, it's been very controversial, but people have accepted it, I think, really, really well, especially now that we've seen 4 or 5 years of having very high usage. And we've seen no reduction in the birds. All the fish are there. The otters are as common as they've ever been. And a lot of key species like dragonflies and damselflies that we keep track of that tell us kind of secondarily what's the health of the ecosystem and what's the abundance of various species. All of those things say, yes, it's rich, wonderful, and in very, very good condition. At the same time, the water quality of the river is as good a water quality as it's ever been. We use a drone, the Verde River Institute uses a drone every day, takes water samples from various places in the river using the drone. The drone has allowed us to do 1,000 to 1,500 water samples a year previous to drone use because of the difficulty of getting in many places and all kinds of other things. You would get maybe 20 or 25. And that's just not enough to tell you what's really going on. So now we have very high resolution data that shows us that the quality of the river, oxygen, pH, the turbidity, suspended solids, all kinds of things that we look at about the quality of the river are actually going up. It's as clean a river as it's ever been. So pretty exciting time in the river's life. So these pictures show you a little bit about what it was like back when the smelter was operating. This is 1914 when they were building it. This is probably 21 or 22. Cindy probably knows. You can make it up if you know. It's about 22, right? I think they put the stacks up, the second stack up in 21.
I believe so.
Yeah. And this bridge right here is the standards for that bridge are still there, right at the before you go downhill on Sycamore Canyon Road, you're in Bean, Peck's Lake, and before the dam, that's where that bridge went across. It, by the way, plays a prominent part in a horrible movie called Desert Fury. How many of you have seen Desert Fury? Right? Not the best film ever produced, but really interesting if you want to see the Verde River. You can see the smelters spewing out smoke in the background while they're talking about the bad guys coming up. You should rent it and watch it sometime. Pretty cool. This bridge right here, we call the Main Street Bridge. I'll show you another picture of it later on. Peck's Lake is right there. Main Street, Clarkdale is right here, so we cross the river. And the abutments for it and a sidewalk that used to lead you up to it are still partly there. There's a farm you've never seen, right? This picture was taken from Sycamore Canyon Road, right at the top of it, right before it goes down the hill to Tapco. This whole farm is gone. So this farm and the farm around the Tapco, the lower Tapco River access point that the town operates now, we're operating for a long, long time. And in fact, that, I just forgot the name of the farmer. Jordan, yeah. So the Jordan farm started right here in Lower Tapco, and it's the one that kind of made Sedona famous for a long time when I was a kid. These farms were destroyed by the bad air quality of the cattle, all kinds of other things like that. And so that disappeared. We'll show you another picture that is where this used to be. But one of the things you want to see is that the river is a very broad, shallow, meandering, what they call a braided channel. The river is that way because, oops, how'd you do that? It's that way because of the beavers. So the beavers would build dams along the river. Those dams would back up ponds. Those ponds would silt in, and that kind of spreads the river out. It develops a big riparian zone around the edges of them. And the beavers then eat the trees that they're growing, essentially. When you get rid of the beavers, you change the river forever. So you get rid of the beavers, the dams go down eventually. The first flood will knock all of those beaver dams out. And then it'll start cutting itself into a deeper channel. It's called an incised channel. And that's what happened to the Verde River. The Verde River that you see today would be unrecognizable back then. It was, in fact, at this time even starting to incise because the beaver trappers were taking more and more of the beavers out. I know I'm meandering, so if you have questions while I meander, yes, ma'am.
The other picture, what was the white part below or behind the mountains?
Where?
The white part between the blue at the top and the mountains?
Oh, this?
Yeah.
Sky?
Okay. I wasn't sure.
You know that thing?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm new to the area. Is Peck's Lake still existing?
We're going to talk about it.
Okay.
Kind of. It's actually filling back up right now, but we'll talk about that. In 1914, this dam was put in. And the dam was put in, it's like the dam was put in to fill Peck's Lake.
Oh.
Now, think about this. You gotta think hard, because Peck's Lake, remember, is an old oxbow of the river that's downstream from here. So it's got to be lower in Peck's Lake than it is here, right? Because water tends to flow downhill. So as it's going past Peck's Lake, it's got to be lower than it is here. The head gate for this dam is 5 feet above the water. So they had to build a pond. Why would you build the tunnel 5 feet above where your water was? Well, they didn't. The tunnel was put in when the Verde River was 5 feet higher because of all those beaver dams.
Oh.
So, after the beaver dams disappear, the river incises, and it's now 5 feet below where it used to be. You have to build a dam to form a pond that raises the level 5 feet to get it back into the tunnel. And that's what this dam did for many, many years. It raised the water then goes through a tunnel that's right over here, over into Peck's Lake. And that was its main purpose for most of our lives. Before that, it also was used for processed water for the smelter. And before that even, before the dam was there were farms over by Peck's Lake. And those farms were watered from Brewer's Tunnel. It's called Brewer's Tunnel. Brewers like people that make beer because a lot of people made beer during Prohibition. What do you know about that, Cindy? Is that right? Cindy's agreed not to call me on the stuff that I lie about.
Is that the dam that's broken that you can see from?
It is.
Kayaking, yeah.
Broken right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is called Brewer's Tunnel Diversion Dam. And it's one of the most onerous dams in the Verde River. In fact, it's the most onerous dam in the Verde River. It changes 7/10 of a mile of river into a pond that wants to be a flowing river. Well, today we're back at that river. We're right here right now. That's that bridge that goes across Main Street over into Lower Clarkdale. There it is. This is not it. Anybody know what this bridge is? Mike. Where's Mike? Somebody knows. Jim?
Jerry knows.
Jerry knows.
I can read the caption.
So this is the swinging bridge that went over to Tapco. If you go up Sycamore Canyon Road, you'll see that big smokestack that's there. That's Tapco, the Arizona Power Company that stood for. It's now APS. And it burnt coal and oil, created electricity for the mines and other things, everything that was going on in the Verde Valley. And this is how you got from Sycamore Canyon across the river over to the Tapco site. But you could see there was quite a little settlement over there at that time. And this was their, I don't know, 70s, something like that. And they tore it down finally.
It was there, and I want to say probably right about 80, because I know
Was
I
it?
walked across it back. I was thinking that was capital.
And that lady was there the whole time.
They just rolled her up and took it down.
Yeah. She's a fixture. So here's the other dam that you've never seen probably. This is the dam that went over to the smelter from Sycamore Canyon Road. So if you go from that dam site, just downstream, you'll see the abutments for this bridge. And this one right here, you go past, or no, it might be that one right there, that is, that one. You go past when you kayak through, and some of the other abutments are there on the shore, west of that. That was a one-lane bridge that handled vehicular traffic and foot traffic. And the smelter you can see in the background right there. Again, we're right here on that hill today. Now you're looking at the Bitter Creek Bridge and Lower Clarkdale. And this is what the river became because of cattle smelters, a lot of people getting the trees out and whatnot. A big kind of flat, barren river with no riparian vegetation at all. So the biodiversity of this river was probably a tenth of what the biodiversity is of the river that we have today. You wouldn't have 240 species of birds that use this. It's just a little bit of water and some sand, right? And probably didn't have very many fish either because you had a high acidic kind of quality to the river. And this is what it looked like for a long, long time. The smelter actually has conveyors and whatnot to dump some of their more disgusting stuff into the river because they treated the river like a sewer. And in fact, that's why people still around here will call it the dirty Verde. Number one, it's got a lot of turbidity when it's flowing high, but it's also, it was no place you wanted to swim or kayak back when this was going on, especially below the smelter. There's the smelter, there's the river. I think there's a dead tree right here and another dead one there. But that stretch right there is now this very thick, wonderful riparian, so it can change. Here it is down here. Here's one of those conveyors dumping stuff into the river. This is right above the dam. No, right below the dam. So the dam is right up here in that shot. Anybody know where that was?
Peck's Lake?
Peck's Lake.
Yeah.
This is Peck's Lake. Edgar Burns was a physician for the cavalry down in Camp Verde in the late 1800s. And those physicians tended to be naturalists also, because they were kind of biologists by nature, and they would keep track of birds and everything. And this is what Peck's Lake, what its natural condition was from about 10,000 years ago until the time that Brewer's Tunnel was put in to feed it water. It was just kind of a flat little wetland, marshy area, and it was a very small one too. Little few springs feed it from the north part of Peck's Lake around there. There used to be hunting parties that would come here and slay millions of ducks. And the ducks are back, by the way, right now to the greatest extent that I've seen them in 10 or 15 years. So we've counted about 1,000 ducks using the drone again just last week out there. So that's pretty good, especially when you see what has become of Peck's Lake. January 1st, 2004, 16 years ago, Freeport-McMoran, or it was Phelps Dodge at the time, decided that they no longer were going to allow public access to the lake. They had come to the town prior to that, 2 years prior, and said, you guys want to continue to lease Peck's Lake and have the use of the cabañas out there and all of those kinds of things, and we're willing to do that. We used to do it for $1 a year. We're going to let you do it for $1 a year, but you're also going to have to maintain the dam that diverts water, and you're going to have to maintain the diversion. So we gathered all the information we could, and it turned out that the average cost to maintain the dam was about $160,000 a year. You had to maintain the dam, you had to repair it every time it blew out, you had to do a lot of other work on it, you had to do larvicide in there because of mosquitoes and whatnot. All of that mounted up to an average of about $160,000 a year. Guess what? Clarkdale couldn't afford it. And every time that dam broke, there's no insurance. They won't insure dams on the Verde River. I don't know why. Well, they probably will.
Did the city of Clarkdale finance the golf course that was there?
No, the golf course was private.
Okay.
But, well, it was actually Phelps Dodge,
Okay.
but it had a private board and everything that ran the golf course.
Huh.
A nice little 9-hole golf course, by the way, and it was right behind that building. That's the
Clubhouse?
no, that's the mansion.
Mansion.
That's the Clark Mansion that burned down. Anyway, it closed on January 1st, 2004. And this is what it looked like 2 months ago.
Oh, dear.
I love this boat. So this boat appeared as the lake disappeared. What happened to the lake? What happened was that in February we had that large flood. It broke the dam. You see it's still broken today. The water went down below the Brewer's Tunnel entrance. So no more water went into Peck's Lake for months and months and months. And Freeport-McMoRan decided it was going to start pumping water from an old well at the top of Sycamore Canyon Road into the lake to try to conserve it, conserve its biological values. But it didn't come anywhere near to keeping up with the amount of water that was evaporating and transpiring from the plants around the lake. And so it began to decline. And it got down to about 4 acres of open water from its previous 100 acres. Guess what happened to a lot of carp? It wasn't fun to watch. So we were monitoring it, again, using the drones. So you could fly in, you could fly the drone at that level if you wanted. Take a lot of photography, do a lot of mapping and everything else, and we could watch as the pond declined and keep track of it. And at one point, this is what appeared. So there was always like, how old is that boat? When was this thing put there? And we're looking at it, and we see that it's got kind of a butt joint here in the front, in the stern. Doesn't seem to have any modern structure to it until that continued to decline. And we could see that this was probably a modern boat. It's probably a plastic kayak because the oar locks and whatnot started to appear. And you can see that there are just parts missing that don't look right by today's standards without those parts. But, so there's this boat. And you wonder, why is this boat in this one little pothole? There's the rest of the lake out there. And there's the boat. So it was a fun mystery for a while. But I think we've come to the conclusion that it's not as old as like Mearns. I thought maybe this is from the 1800s, but it ain't. But it's pretty cool. Anybody that wants to go out and get it, just call Freeport-McMoRan and tell them you'd like to go get that kayak. Drag it out of about 5 feet of mud and silt here. You can see all the raccoon tracks and turtle tracks that are around it there. There it is again. So this was all water. It was about 8 feet of water before this decline. Quite a big change. That's the lake. Looking toward the west, Mingus Mountain on the left, smelter site there. And that boat sits in one of these holes right here. There it is from the other end, looking the other direction. So now we know more about Peck's Lake than we've ever known. Because we know where it gets its water. You can see the springs putting what small amount of water they contribute to it. In a couple of places right over here on the north side. And you can see how deep it was. You can see old tackle boxes. There's an old tackle box that sits right up here. I think Duff Sorrell's left. This is the biggest flood ever on the Verde River. This is the Tuzagoot Bridge right here, looking west, kind of. This is 53,400 cubic feet per second, the most ever recorded.
Huh.
So we don't know about how big they were before they put the gauges in the 60s, or no, in the early 1900s, and I think 1960. This is the highest flood ever in all that time. So you get a flood like this with a lot of trees around it, the river will survive, and those trees can survive even a flood like this. these big trees here are in the what's called the slack area of the flood, and they survived. All of the close trees, all the alders and things that were right near the river are gone because of this flood. But prior to 1906, when the river had none of those trees that would slow the flood down and absorb a lot of its energy and everything else, that's when the river really incised and went down that 5 or more feet in elevation. Because now there was nothing to block any kind of a flood. The smallest flood that you can have would incise a river in that condition. So this was taken actually from my house, right below Mike's house.
What year was that, Bill?
That was 1993, February, early February 1993. All of the biggest floods that have ever been on the river have been in February. Anybody know why? Snow melt, right. Got a big pack of snow up on the Muggione Rim and up around Flagstaff. Louder? All right. So all of the biggest floods on the Verde River have been in February, and the reason is a lot of snow is up in the upper Muggione Rim, Flagstaff area. Then you get 2 or 3 days of warm rain in February, and it'll melt all of that snow at one time. And when that happens, it all comes downhill, right? And that's what happened on that day, February 3rd, 1993.
How many days did it stay flooded?
Well, it was at flood stage for about 5-6 days. It took quite a while.
Yes.
Even a small flood will take a long time. What happens in a flood is the flow goes up like this, and then it goes very gradually back down to normal. So it'll be at flood stage for a long time for a couple of reasons. Like, you love all this technical stuff, I'm sure. But when you have a flood like this, a lot of this water gets stored in the banks. Okay, everything gets wet, and they get all soaked up with water. As the flood stops, and the reason for the flood stops coming down, that water starts discharging back into the river. It starts draining all of that. So it's called bank storage, typically. And so the bank storage is why that curve goes down very slowly. So a lot of the things that we're doing today, as I said at the beginning, are aimed at keeping water in the river, and secondarily keeping the ecosystem very safe and healthy that water supports. And so lots of different projects: flow restoration, threatened and endangered species, invasives removal and replacement with native vegetation is a really major project, very expensive, very time consuming, and very difficult to do over any long period of time. Some of these invasives are really, really anxious to get by the river. Things like tree of heaven that grow all around up here, the salt cedar, the giant reed is also one of the big 3 invasives. So getting rid of those and having them replaced by willow and cottonwood is a major project, but again, very difficult. A lot of recreational improvements along this stretch of the Verde River that goes through the Verde Valley. When I wrote the first economic development paper, I was hired by the Walton Family Foundation. They wanted to know what the status of the connection between the economic vitality of the Verde Valley was as it relates to the Verde River, and how big a part did the Verde River play in the economy of the Verde Valley. The answer was almost none. Farming, alfalfa and corn and whatnot, those were the biggest economic components of the economy of the river in the Verde Valley. And then there were things like property down by the river is a little more expensive than it is. All those kinds of things are kind of secondary. But we wrote in that paper that you couldn't find the Verde River by driving through the Verde Valley. You can drive all the way through the Verde Valley and not see the Verde River. And back when we wrote this paper, there was not one sign on 260 or anywhere else that said, here's how you get to the Verde River. So we bought all of those signs. and worked with the Forest Service and with ADOT and the county to put those signs that you see now that say, you know, recreation, birding, all of those kinds of signage. And started improving those places where the public could get to the river. Because we knew that until people started to see the river and interact with it, they didn't care what happened to it. It's just like if you live in Prescott right now, you can tell those people all day long, the water that you're using is depleting our river. They never see it. It's just this abstract thing. But if you can get people down to it, put them in a boat, make them fly fish or bird or whatever they want to do, now they care about the river, and now they're going to do what's necessary to conserve it. So that's a big part of what's going on today. In the town of Clarkdale, by the way, you can feel very proud of your town because we're doing more than anybody else as far as conservation of the Verde River. If Clarkdale wasn't doing what it was doing, I would say, and this will be a controversial thing to say, I would say 3/4 of all the conservation being done on the river would halt. I would say you'd lose this river without Clarkdale's leadership and the people's support and the improvement of the recreational facilities that Clarkdale has done to introduce the river to so many people. So it's been a wonderful place to work and be a mayor. Clarkdale it's just like, wow. You couldn't ask for anything more than this if you grew up caring about rivers and fish. A lot of science is being done right now by the Verde River Institute primarily, my organization. We do a lot of water quality, we do a lot of flow studies, we do a lot of analysis of the biodiversity of what's around the river and whatnot. And all of that science that's being done gives us a really good indication of how things are changing and if something is happening that we ought to be paying attention to. Do we need to intervene somewhere because the otters are leaving or whatever? And without that science being done, nobody really knows. You've just got kind of anecdotal evidence of any of this. And a few people that are out there voting. One of the biggest and most difficult parts of conservation of the river are the policy changes that need to be made. So water policy in Arizona is not geared toward conserving rivers. It's geared toward how do we use up water and how do we distribute that water to the people that have a right to it. It doesn't really consider flowing rivers as part of that customer base. And so trying to change the laws of Arizona or just the policies of cities and towns in the Verde Valley and in the watershed to recognize that what's going on is doing harm or good to the river is a difficult thing. Changing government is really hard, right? I don't know if you've learned this or not, but people don't like to change. They don't like it. And they don't like for us to say, you've got to change. So you have to find ways to deal with those kinds of things and continue to have a wonderful Verde River. And I think now the consciousness in the town of Clarkdale is the best anywhere in the state on any conservation project. The people in Clarkdale are devoted to having a healthy Verde River. And that's why it's such a privilege and honor to be on the council that makes those kinds of decisions. And I have to tell you, the first thing the council thinks about anything that has to do with the river is how's that going to impact this river? Is it going to be more water, better water, more animals and trees? Then we're there. If it's less, we're not there. And that's a difficult thing for politicians. Yes, ma'am.
I was at a group event several months ago, and they said that the depth of the Verde River has decreased yearly. Is that true?
It is. So today, I haven't looked at the gauge today. What is it? Did you look at it? I don't know. But today, let's say it's running at about 70 cubic feet per second, something like that. So when I was a kid, on a typical day in February before the floods, it would have been about 110. And you can see there are charts on the Verde River Institute's website that show that decline over time. And those we get from a gauge that's just upstream from Tapco, about 3 miles. So yes, it is true. The reason for it is primarily climate. You know, we're in the new normal as far as climate's concerned. This is not a drought. This is what it's supposed to be. We're back to kind of the normal from before pre-industrial times. And when all of the laws in Arizona and the conservation, or not the conservation, but the utilization of the river's water and the Colorado River's water were all established at a time when we had unusually high flows. So we thought, oh, we got lots of water. We can allocate this, you know, people will have it forever and help everybody and the economy will be great. And then the climate changed and the water went down and now we're struggling with it, especially on the Colorado. But yes, it's true. So this 70 would have been about 110 when I was a kid. And we're trying to keep it to where it doesn't go below about 50 at the Clarkdale gauge in the summertime, and it's bumping 50 right now. So, we'll see. Aww. They are cute. When you see them on the river, when we take groups of people out, we take about 400 people a year out on the river, the Verde River Institute. You can sign up for a trip by visiting our website. We'll take you out and teach you all of these things about the river. And when we see otters, it's like, all right, the trip's done. Might as well get off now. Because these guys are such fun. You know what their primary food is? What?
Crayfish?
Fish?
Crayfish. How do you know that?
Okay.
Oh, it says that. Getting dead, I can feel it. Yeah, they eat crayfish, and they're all invasives.
So is there an effort to get rid of the crayfish?
No,
Or is
no.
that they are?
No, but here's a fun story. So all of these otters who love to eat crayfish came from Louisiana. They eat crayfish etouffee, they eat it.
So which came first, the crayfish or the otter?
No, there were otters here historically.
Okay.
So they're natural here, but they were extirpated by fur traders.
Okay.
There were no otters until the 80s, and the Game and Fish Department brought a bunch of otters in from Louisiana and put them back in the river, and now they're really healthy. There's
Yeah.
tons of them out there. They're supposed to eat fish, but they've developed this taste for crayfish, luckily, because crayfish aren't supposed to be here, and they're a terrible invasive. They eat everything out of the river.
Huh.
So these guys help us with that. And they'll race along below your kayak, or, you know, so you see an otter, you've had a good day.
Yeah, I see otters.
These are things that you don't have a good day about. So this is giant reed, Arundo donax. People call it bamboo here because it looks kind of like bamboo or cane. It came in from the Mediterranean. And they used it for bank stabilization and ornamental uses and whatnot for a long time, and now it has invaded the river, and it grows in solid patches. It's a grass. So you can go out there and cut that whole patch of it down to the nub, and in 3 weeks it's back up. Because it's a grass, you just mowed it. It likes that.
Yeah.
So what they have to do with this is they have to go in, they have to cut it, then they have to poison it. You have to be really careful about using poison near the Verde River.
Yeah.
So the Friends of the Verde Rivers Restoration Project, the Verde Watershed Restoration Coalition, has a very strict protocol about how that's done with all of these invasive plants. And they're slowly getting rid of it all. Hopefully that's all replaced by cottonwoods and willows, but guess what? Some of it grows back. And it's like slowly wants to go back to the condition that it was in before you cut it. So you've got to keep treating it and keep treating it. It's a very long-tailed project, that's called. Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima, came down from Jerome. It came down from mining. Why mining in Ailanthus? Anybody know?
Because the ground was so denuded from the smelters and people living up there and burning firewood. It took all the natural wood out.
So there is that. But the reason that Arundo didn't get, or Ailanthus didn't get taken out is that it's tolerant to very bad air quality. So some of the miners that were in Jerome noticed that all the plants are dead. People were complaining about it, and they said, hey, back home, there were Chinese miners and people from the Orient. And they said, we've got a tree back there that's great. You know, it doesn't care about that. So they brought it out. They seeded it all over the place. And it becomes one of the worst invasives along the Verde River. It grows in solid patches for tens and hundreds of acres. Again, you've got to take it out and you've got to poison it because the roots will come up again. Anybody ever try to get rid of this in their yard? Yeah, not easy. Not easy, but worth doing. And finally, salt cedar. Tamarix. Oh, I didn't bring a picture of this, darn it. Anyway, we're getting rid of all of the salt cedar in the Verde River that's near Clarkdale. Last year, almost 70% of it died back to nothing because there's a wonderful beetle that attacks just tamarisk. And that beetle got here last year. Over a 3-week period, we had solid green tamarisk near Brewer's Tunnel Diversion, and upstream from it, it all went brown and dead in 3 weeks because of this beetle.
And the beetle came on its own?
What?
The beetle came on its own, or was it introduced?
Some of each. So the beetle got here on its own. It was introduced north of us in Colorado and other places. And we just hope it's true that it doesn't eat anything but tamarisk, you know, that it won't shift its interests elsewhere. But it's done a really good job.
Where can I get some of these beetles?
Well, they'll get there. Don't worry. Wherever you are, they'll get there. Because they're here. We'll see a tremendous die-off of tamarisk this summer when the beetles breed, when all their eggs hatch and the larvae start eating tamarisk. So, cool. I'm sorry I didn't bring pictures.
Doug, where did the tamarisk come from?
So, tamarisk came from the Mediterranean primarily. And there are 7 or 8 species of it. We just kind of lump them all into tamarisk and don't bother trying to figure out which species we're dealing with because they're all really similar. Some are very tall trees and some are scrubby, but there are several. I think there are about 3 species in the Verde Valley. Yeah, it's a big tree in the Mediterranean. If you go to Israel or the Middle East anywhere, you'll see a lot of big tamarisk. It's one of the main trees. Very hardy. These are a few of the fish and animals that are threatened and endangered in the Verde River. I don't have a picture of it, but there's the Colorado pike minnow. That's a minnow this guy's holding here.
Yeah.
You know what you catch if you put one of these in there. So Colorado pike minnow get to be about as long as I am tall, 6 feet. And we are starting to see a few of them here and there. People caught one in this stretch last year. So that's really cool. One of the problems that they have is they can't get past dams and they want to spawn in the upper reaches of the river. So with the Brewer's Tunnel Diversion Dam going down, that's a big step to having more pike minnow and other native species that can now get to their spawning grounds in the upper part of the river. We have a few more dams in the river to worry about, but this was a big one. This was a fish barrier here in Clarkdale. Pike minnow or loach minnow and pike minnow are both very small, spiked base. And this guy, the razorback sucker, will get about that long. He's got this big ridge here because he lives in really rapid water and he uses it to stay oriented in fast water. Then last year, the northern Mexican garter snake was listed. These are common, virtually common, around Tapco. So if you're out there and you see a garter snake, in all likelihood, it's a northern Mexican garter snake. The narrow-headed garter snake is a fast water, more of an Oak Creek type snake. And then the yellow-billed cuckoo, where we have the highest concentration of breeding yellow-billed cuckoos anywhere in the Southwest, right here in Clarkdale. We call it Cuckoo Island. When you're at Lower Tapco River Access Point, there's an island right across from where you park, and there are always cuckoos breeding right in there, and several more as you go downstream toward Tuesday. Beautiful bird. recreational improvements we really talked about already. So again, back to Brewer's Tunnel diversion. Got the diversion dam down here. There's the slag pile. The smelter is right over here. If you go out here, if you had gone out here last year before the dam broke, you would see that this is all solid trees now. So I show people pictures of our trip. I show them a picture like this where this is all sand and rock. 3 years later, it's all cottonwood and willow trees. So they grow really quickly. They're the perfect tree for what's called a flashy river, a river that flash floods easily and frequently. Then on February 3rd, this is what happened. That dam breached right here, drained 7/10 of a mile of pond behind it that was 4 or 5 feet deep, is now inches deep, a foot deep in many places. And this is the slag pile. That's west, east, downstream. This used to be a pond in here, but you can see in this, it's now a very shallow rock bed riffle. If you have a pond on a river like the Verde, you have a mud bottom. Okay, very fine silt mud bottom. A couple of worms live in there. That's about it. You turn that into a rocky riffle and all of a sudden your biodiversity increases 100-fold. So now you might have 100 species of dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies, stoneflies, all of these little flies whose larvae live under the rocks for a couple of years before they emerge as adults. And now we have 7/10 of a mile of the most highly biodiverse habitat anywhere on the Verde River because that dam broke. Really, really cool, this riffle right here. These rocks that you'll see, we've all kayaked past these rocks. These were put in as a secondary road in case something happened. Is when the main bridge, the smelter bridge, was getting rickety, and they decided they'd better have a secondary way of getting across the river. This was that way it came across. That's where those rocks came from. Pretty cool. And they're still there even after 53,000 CFS. That was instructive to the town of Clarkdale, as it is trying to add the area around Brewer's Tunnel diversion to our park system. And we expect that to be done sometime in the next few months, that we'll adopt that stretch into our park system, lease it from Freeport-McMoran, and actually use boulders like this to guide the river into some kind of a productive way that has several different benefits. One is you can make a really interesting little kayak run through there with those rocks, and at the same time create more of this rock bottom riffle that is high on biodiversity, and primarily from a restoration standpoint, you'll avoid having that river cut a new incised channel. And that, if that starts to happen when you take a dam out, that cut will work its way upstream and you'll lose all of this rock riffle, and you will incise the channel down below the roots of cottonwoods and willows where they can't reach it. So you lose all your streamside vegetation. So what the town of Clarkdale's plan is, around Brewers, all of this area here, is to turn it into an interesting place for people to recreate, to be educated about the river, and then have an educational component to this that's much more intense than anything going on today. And at the same time, prevent the head cut that could start right here where the dam was, if that weren't done. So when you see those kinds of things happening, or the discussion about how they should be happening, or how they are going to be happening, come to the council meetings, come to the planning and zoning meetings, and give us your 2 cents about what you think of it. And know that the goal here is to retain the riparian vegetation along the side of the channel, and to create more of this very biodiverse kind of riffle area through there. This was the happiest, maybe the happiest day of my life. I wanted the stand on since I was a kid, really. Because it's just been this onerous, terrible fish barrier, mud pond making thing.
You haven't mentioned any of the eagles, are they, you haven't said a word about our eagles.
We had an eagle on, yeah, the eagles are here today. So they go past our house, my house, every day. They fly right over the deck. So we have Clarkdale, 2 bald eagles that live right there. We didn't name them. It's their names. Clarkdale normally had been nesting just upstream from us. In fact, if you go to Lower Tapco River Access Point, we started that park a mile upstream, a mile and a quarter upstream from there. And we built roads and we built trails. It was really cool. Nice access road that was all done with chipped up trees and stuff. It was great. It was great. And then Clarkdale said, "This is great. We're going to put our nest right above your kayak put-in.
Oh, dear.
And you can't use this park then for 8 months out of the year." Because at the time they were endangered. They're no longer endangered, but they're still, we care about them. So their nest never succeeded. They tried twice and never nested there again. And in fact, they haven't nested for the last 2 years. So they're siblings actually, which I discovered by taking very high resolution images of them, and I could read the bands on their legs. And they determined that they were both born of the same parents, but at separate years. And that could have something to do with why they've never had a successful hatch. Jim?
Are there plans in the works to reopen that area up there?
Yes. So more work for you. So here's the idea, originally. And it's not, this is a very half-baked idea. Don't take it home and say this is what the town's going to do. It's just what we're thinking about right now is reopening that upper park. And initially reopening it just for special events or commercial use. Not because that's the way we always want it to be. We don't want it to be something special for commercial use. But we want to open it in a way that eases that into the inventory of park space and everything for Clarkdale. It's very expensive for Clarkdale to maintain parks. They don't normally pay their own way, but Lower Tapco and Tuesday River Access Point, Tuesday Wrap, do pay for themselves in parking fees and other kinds of things like that. All of the kayaks that go down, all the commercial kayaks, pay the town $5 per person. And all of those fees are put right back into the parks. So the town of Clarkdale's tax base is almost unaffected by those particular parks. Now you add another big park like that and you got Jim Mast up there, and we're paying him to take care of another park, and you've got people that have to go up and make sure it's safe, and you've got to have the police patrol every once in a while. All of this stuff has to happen. But you're not making any money on that park. And now you've got a drain on your general fund. So what we're going to do probably is open it to commercial use first and charge those commercial users an additional fee to the one that they're currently paying. They'll get that from their customer because they'll have another 1.5 miles of river to float. And then we'll use that money to build up how we start paying Jim to go up there and take care of that other park, so that we can continue with our promise to the town of Clarkdale that we're going to use minimal general fund money for these particular parks. So the answer is yes, and I'm really getting anxious for that to happen. So we probably add that at the same time that we add this section to the park. The bottom of our park now is right here. So we would add about, I think it's a 1/2 mile of river to the park there. You add Upper Tapco to that, you're kind of in control then of about 6.5 miles of Verde River, which is wow. Nobody does that. That's cool for a small town like Clarkdale. Pat yourselves on the back. You had a question.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying earlier about beaver, and what you were talking about with the boulders and the incising there. I've seen other places where they introduced some beaver and the water level went up like 6 feet.
Yeah.
couple of years. Do we have beaver now?
Sure, ponds here.
So they might,
They don't build dams here. They build dams in the upper reaches of the river where there are constricted areas and you don't have high flows. This is so prone to flash flooding that the beavers give up after a while. They just thought, all right, we built it and it blew out. We built it and it blew out. And the only ones that are left are the ones that don't care about that. And they now live under the bank in caves under the bank. They'll dive down into the water into a hole and then come up in a cave. So they're called bank beavers.
that's different from the way it used to be at one point?
It is.
Because it takes, but because there's not enough upstream beavers to keep stopping the water, or?
Well, remember that the river used to be a wide, flat, meandering thing, right? So any flood that came down was spread over a large area, and that means that the energy of the flood is dispersed over a very wide section of river. It doesn't do as much damage that way. When the river is incised like this, all of that water goes down that same channel, and you have a huge amount of energy being put into cutting that, and it would cut down all of those dams. So the historic condition of the river, very different from what it is today, and beaver dams couldn't survive then, and you had lots of them in this stretch.
Were the beavers entirely hunted out and these are transplants?
No, these aren't transplants. Beavers are rodents, remember. So rodents tend to reproduce, and they're no different. So they were almost extirpated, though. So very few were left. It got to where it was no longer economically feasible to trap beavers for a living. And once they got down to that level, the fur trappers just left, and the beavers came back. But they came back to a different river than the one that, you know, they lived in historically. So that's the Brewers Tunnel Diversion Dam area that we're thinking of adding to the park. This is the dam, and this is where the dam is broken. We expect that when this dam is taken out, probably the course of the river will be right here, right at the stream side, because that's where it was for a lot of its life. But it was also, this is an old channel of the river right here, right behind this little levee. This is actually a bunch of rock. But the river used to run here. I have pictures of it also, with people playing in the river way over here. And this is where that farm was that I showed you the picture of. It was all in this area here. So we have an opportunity with this to put the river where we want it until a huge flood happens, and then it's, you know, all bets are off. But yeah, that's the area we'll be working in. I don't know if we're probably out of time. Did you expect to be here this long, Cindy?
So Freeport will remove what's left of the dam.
Oh, good. Thank you.
No, I'm asking. That's a question.
Yeah.
It's not like a statement.
I know. Smart guy. So here's the idea, is that if you're going to take out a dam like that, it's by the way, it's 1/2-inch steel corrugated metal. Each panel is about 16 feet long. 8 feet of it are under the ground and might be embedded in concrete. We're not sure yet. So if you're going to take out that whole dam, you're going to have a whole bunch of heavy equipment in there. As long as you got a whole bunch of heavy equipment in there, why don't we do something that's beneficial and interesting at the same time? And that levee, this levee right here, this is all big rock like that, stacked up to keep the water over here so that it would go into the head gate. This rock right here could be distributed in such a way that tames the river in most conditions. Again, you'll see this was here prior to 1953, and it all is still there after that huge flood. So the right sized boulders can do a lot of good, even in a very flashy river. And all of those boulders are here. So you say to Freeport McMoran, we would like to lease this space, and hey, as long as you got all that heavy equipment, let's do something cool, you know, something that really works. They have committed to taking out the dam to not repairing this breach. And I asked Sandy Fabritz, who's their water resources director, when do you expect to do that? She said February. This was like 4 months ago. I was like, no. Nothing happens that fast. Nothing. So you got to get all kinds of permits from the Corps of Engineers and everybody else to approve whatever you're going to do in here. And so we want to come to Freeport and to the Corps of Engineers at the same time and say, this is what we want the river to look like when this project is done. So sometime this year, we'll see. Yes, sir.
So what does that mean for the future of Pex Lake? What's the plan?
Anybody answer that question?
Turns into a bog?
So, Pex Lake was traditionally, or historically, a wetland, kind of a marshy area, a lot like Tavasi Marsh was when it used to be natural. It's all screwed up now too. And that's what we would expect Pex Lake to be as a natural area. And in fact, the biodiversity of a wetland like that is as high as it would have been in Pex Lake, most of which is invasive vegetation, Eurasian milfoil, water lily, invasive kinds of cattail and whatnot. So when all of those plants dry up and are left or leave, then it could become another natural wetland marsh area. The other choice is that you continue to run this pump that's now pumping water into it. And I mentioned that the lake is actually recovering to a certain extent. It's got about 20 acres of open water right now. It got down to 4. That's because in the wintertime, the trees and the plants are not sucking up water and there's not much evaporation. When it starts ETing, evapotranspiring again, we'll see how much of a lake that pump can retain. But we don't think it's going to be much. And you know that having that huge pump, 250 gallon a minute pump or an hour pump, a minute, 250 GPM pump costs a lot of money. And you're still really pumping Verde River water. You're just pumping it from the ground right near the river. But I wish I could answer what's going to happen to Pex Lake, but it's up to Freeport-McMoran and to some extent the input from the town of Clarkdale saying, here's what we would like to see, but here's how we would like to see that water get in there, or how much water, or whatnot. So it's a big, complex biological problem. I wish I could answer. Anything else? Anything you'd like to me to lie to you?
Water is Prescott taking at this point?
How much are they taking? Well, not a lot. Not a lot. They're taking a lot of water out of Little Chino and the Agua Fria, actually, the watershed. Prescott Valley and Prescott are. But what they want to do is open what's called their water ranch, which is in the headwater aquifer of the Verde River. In other words, the water that actually creates the headwaters is in the Big Chino aquifer between Seligman and Chino Valley. And so they want to start pumping in there. But Prescott and Prescott Valley are only a very small part of the problem up there. There are also plans, in one stage or another, to put more than 30,000 new homes in there. We think all those homes are going to want water, because that's been our experience everywhere else. And that means that they're going to be depleting the Verde River as much as Prescott ever will. And then you've got the pump storage project. Anybody heard about that? Kind of fun. So if you have a lot of excess renewable energy being created in the California desert, you want a place to store it, right? And how do you store solar energy? It's pretty hard to do. You can have very expensive batteries and other kinds of things like that. But another way of doing it is you take two lakes, one that's really high and one that's really low. And while energy is cheap in the daytime and you're getting too much of it, you run pumps to fill the lake at the top, and then you run that water back down past generators, just like the generators that are on the Colorado and the Salt and everywhere else. And they create electricity at a time when you need it. So you buy it when it's cheap, you pump the water up, and when the cost of electricity goes up during the day, the water goes back down and generates electricity. It's called a pump storage project, and that's getting through the permitting process, the federal permitting process right now. It could use about, 1,500 to 2,000 acre feet of water a year, just in evaporation from the lakes. But it could use a whole lot more filling them up the first time. So those are the kinds of things that threaten the headwaters of the Verde River. And you have to be very careful. And the town of Clarkdale, by the way, is the only town in the Verde Valley that interceded in that case with the regulators. It's like this is everybody's Verde River, and this was the only town, pat yourselves on the back, that interceded in the case so that we can give our comments to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and others about how that thing should be built in such a way that it didn't harm the Verde